Here is Colorverse Crab Nebula, a green ink.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
Here we get a green so dark sometimes it might be black if it wasn't for so certainly being a green. I know that's such a weird description, but in performance it behaves like a perfect black with crisp dark lines and no shading for most all of the papers. Now on non-fountain pen friendly paper it does lighten a little bit, but it still stays a very nice dark green. While I think Colorverse is or was mostly great marketing, I do have to acknowledge they do make some very beautiful inks, and this would be near the top of that list, and I really would appreciate the hell out of a bottle of this ink because it looks great on the page.
The pen for today is a Sailor Pro Gear Slim with a fine nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we see a green that is so dark it might almost pass for a black for people that aren't used to really seeing this type of thing. Amazing what we're getting on this Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread, no shading, looks just beautifully dark the whole way. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue our notes back here. Oh yeah, that all goes on between the wiggling fingers.
Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer.
Here is Colorverse Saturn V. Here is Colorverse C Europa. Here is Colorverse Sea of Tranquility. Here is Colorverse Space Laka.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
Here we have a tone that is ever so slightly lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, and it does not spread, it does not shade. It comes across as a beautifully super dark green. And again, for many people, they might not even realize this is a green unless you're truly used to looking at this stuff. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can continue the great story that's going on with this ink.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we have a tone that is just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, but definitely more green, certainly being affected by the tone of the paper, which means that this ink is more translucent than we would have probably expected, or at least I would have probably expected, given how dark it is. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, doesn't shade, doesn't look black, looks green for sure to me here. Now, hopefully it really translates on camera, but just such a wow as an ink. Looking at the back of the page, we see that there is a little bit of some issue. It gets very deep into the paper. I don't know that you would want to continue writing with this ink on the other side, because you might start to corrupt both sets of notes, which isn't a good thing. Different ink perhaps, but I would avoid this paper with this ink for this reason. Now, while it got very deep into the paper and there's a fair amount of ghosting, nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we have that same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, doesn't shade, looks amazing the whole time. Just on the verge of black, but definitely green. It's just so nice. Now, it stands out against the quad rule without any kind of a problem. I'd have been surprised if it did have a problem given how dark it is. but the vertical lines are not cutting the ink at all, which is a little contradictory. It makes me feel like, it's opaque enough to hold itself against these lines. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, continue those happy notes.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Birmingham Pen Company Shenley Park Thicket Green. Here is Blackstone Australian Bush. Here is Califolio Vert Moyen. Here is Caran-d'Ache Vibrant Green.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
This is the first real big tone change that we get for this ink, that it has gotten quite a bit lighter. It's still a very dark green, but it in no way could pass as a black ink on this paper. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, doesn't shade. It is here an amazing green. As much as I've liked it on all of the papers, really, I think that what we're getting here is one of its best versions, next to the Clairfontaine. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, continue those happy lab notes.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Elixir Tangerine. Here is Mont Blanc Lavender Purple. Here is Sailor Cairo Duro. Here is Diatramentis Artist Ink Red.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
This tone is a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, about the same that we had with the composition notebook. It's got no feathering. There's almost no spread. There's no shading. I think we have a perfect ink to really be used on this copy paper, because you would think, looking at this, that this is a more premium paper, and it's not. This is such a great combination. Looking at the back of the page, this is the only downside that we get, that it does get deeper into the paper. You couldn't write back here, but it did not bleed through, touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The medium flow fine of this Sailor Pro Gear Slim gives a lovably dark green, as in I love this, and it rarely shades. I rarely would go for a green that doesn't shade a ton, but this one really stood out very well. Now, I tried it in a very dry fine off camera, and it did lighten the tone and increase the amount of shading just a little bit, but it was still a winner. So, the choice, I say a wet or medium flow fine for this amazing green. Even though you won't get much shading, you're just gonna get an amazingly dark green.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.